Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibiers, welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Good to have you here. We're going to do our music fact of the day. First clip ever aired on MTV was by the band Buggles with the music Video Killed the Radio Star. The first clip ever aired on MTV Europe was the Dire Straits' Money for Nothing. What a great song. The Dan Markel case. I remember very clearly when his murder happened, and that case went cold for a while. We didn't hear a whole lot about it. Seemed to be a big whodunit. I really honestly don't remember anybody being arrested for it, but when Charlie Adelson went to trial, my interest was piqued. And I started looking into the case a little bit, but I was busy covering Caitlin Armstrong and some stuff before that. And then Donna got arrested at the airport trying to go to Vietnam. And I thought, gotta hop on this one. Come to find out, a lot of my listeners are not super familiar with the backstory of this case. So I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to devote a few episodes to catching up to where we are now, because I think it's heating up. And I don't know that the arrest of Donna is going to be the rest of the arrest in this case. That is a lot of rest and arrest in one sentence. But with every case I cover, I like to do a very deep dive on the backstory. And today, if you're familiar with this case, you're going to say, but you didn't talk about this or that. This is really just the framework. This is kind of the foundation of the case. We will be revisiting parts of today to tell the whole story. But I wanted to do one episode where we get the whole picture and kind of a general picture. And then we're really going to dive into the specifics and all the things we now know due to the other trials that have happened. There have been 3 trials. There was 1 guilty plea, 3 trials that all ended in guilty verdicts. Donna's next. So let's tell this backstory. Dan Markel, he was 41 years old and a law professor at FSU. He was found shot on July 18th of 2014, just before 11 a.m. in his car. He was in his garage. The car was still running, and he had been talking to somebody on the phone. This is in Tallahassee, Florida. He was shot 2 times in the head, execution style. He passed 14 hours later on July 19th in the early morning hours at a hospital in Tallahassee, Florida. Well, who was Dan? Dan was born to Phil and Ruth Markel on October 9th, 1972 in Toronto, Canada. Dan was very committed to his Jewish faith from a very, very early age. He really liked everything about the customs and the traditions. His religion was very much a central part of his life. Dan attended Cambridge and Harvard University, earned his law degree in 2001. After that, he worked as a law clerk to a federal judge and also was working in Washington, D.C. at a firm. He was practicing white-collar criminal defense. He was really thriving, on his way to a partnership and really starting to make a name for himself. He met Wendy Adelson, who was also in law school at the time they met, on a dating app called JDate. That is an app specifically for people of Jewish faith. Wendy comes from a very wealthy family in South Florida. Her father, Harvey Adelson, owned a very successful dental practice, and her brother, Charlie Adelson, joined that practice after graduating college. Wendy's mother, Donna, also worked in the practice on the business end of things, patient relations. Wendy also has a second brother, Rob. He is a physician. At first, the relationship was long distance, with Dan being in DC, Wendy being in Miami, but they were able to form a very strong connection very quickly and would spend a lot of weekends together to bridge that gap between the two of them. Ultimately, Dan decided that he wanted to teach law. He was offered a job as a law professor at Florida State University in Tallahassee. The university also offered Wendy a teaching position on a contract basis. Dan and Wendy got engaged, and they were married in February of 2006. Now, the wedding was beautiful and perfect, but there was one little thing that could be seen as a foreshadowing of the different priorities between Dan and Wendy and her family. Having a traditional Jewish wedding was a big priority for Dan. And while both set of parents contributed to the cost of the wedding, the Adelsons were in charge of hiring the caterers. Dan wanted the food to be kosher, keeping in line with Jewish tradition. When it was time for the reception, he found out that the food was anything but kosher, which showed that the Adelsons put their wishes above Dan's. After the wedding, the couple located to Tallahassee, Florida. It's a small college town, and that whole town revolves around Florida State University. kind of a sleepy town, very different from the very fast paced and happening Miami, Florida, where Wendy was born and raised. And here comes the babies. They have two sons together within 2 years of each other, very close in age. And Dan, of course, was over the moon. He had planned to raise the boys in the Jewish faith as he had been his whole life. Also, at the same time, Dan was rising in the legal community. He was a renowned speaker, a scholar, and just a very respected legal professional who was in high demand. At the same time, Wendy was becoming increasingly unhappy. With Dan's travels to go to these different lectures and conferences, Wendy was oftentimes left home with the boys, and that wasn't necessarily what she wanted to do full time with her life. She wanted to establish herself in her career. And she also was feeling like she was not seen as an equal by Dan in the marriage. Now, Writing Class Radio is a podcast that Wendy made after the murder of Dan, where she talks about how she thought she could cheat the system by marrying a man she did not have a passionate love for because she says, didn't that die anyway during marriage? She said the marriage began to fizzle once the sons were born, and also the loneliness of being married to someone who didn't see her as an equal began to creep in. Wendy's also a writer, and she wrote a fictional novel that very much parallels their life with different town names and different character names, but you put them side by side, it's identical. The title was This Is Our Story. She complained of a lot of things in that book, such as moving to a town for her husband's career, complaining about the weather, how hot it was. But she also had praise for the residents of that community and how warm and open everybody was. Another part of the novel said, we built love like a house of cards. No support, pulled away from our support systems. We just couldn't make it work for each other. This seems to be more of a Wendy problem. Dan was thriving. And we're going to get into the dynamics of the Adelson family and that failure to launch with both of these kids, where they very much still listen to their parents. Everything their parents suggested, it seemed. These adult children did whatever their parents wanted. In the podcast, Wendy complained about Dan not reading the novel that she wrote. That devastated Wendy. And I think in her mind, probably validated those feelings of inadequacy or feeling like she was not an equal to her husband. She said on the podcast, quote, he didn't like fiction, so why read my novel? She did say she thinks that Dan loved her the best way he knew how. But the marriage was slowly unraveling, and Dan was away on a business trip in New York City in September of 2012. While he was there, he confided to a close friend that he thought the marriage with Wendy was coming undone, saying that she was uninterested and seemed depressed. Now, while Dan was on this trip, Wendy, on the other hand, was hard at work in Tallahassee. She was filing for divorce on September 10th, emptying their house and planning to take their sons to Miami, where her family lived. She moved money around in preparation for the split. She had clearly been thinking about this for a long time. While Dan was on that business trip in New York, Wendy informed Dan that she was leaving him. So Dan cuts his business trip short and comes back home to address the issue. But when Dan returned home, the house was largely empty and the divorce papers were on their bed. To add insult to injury, Wendy took Dan's uncle's diamond engagement ring, which was very special to him. Over the course of that next year, Dan focused on trying to get Wendy to reconcile, but he wasn't successful. Wendy made very clear to Dan the marriage was over and there was zero chance of them ever getting back together. Dan never could have imagined just how bad things would get between the two regarding their two sons. The divorce was very bitter, and it got more bitter as time went on. There was a huge custody battle over their sons, and on June 20th of 2013, Wendy filed a motion to relocate their sons to Miami. The goal was to be closer to her family. The divorce just reached a fever pitch. It got personal. It was vicious. Dan was panicked at the thought that he would not be a regular fixture in the lives of his boys. And at the same time, Wendy was throwing everything at him in court that she could. Ultimately, a judge sided with Dan and denied her motion to move the boys back to Miami. He also dismissed Wendy's request with prejudice, meaning Wendy could not readdress that issue in court. It was over. It was done. The decision was final, and it wasn't going to change. You think about it. She would have been tied to Tallahassee until those boys were at least 18 years old. At the time of the murders, they were 3 and 5. After the judge denied her request to relocate the boys, Her mother, Donna, became very unhinged and almost obsessed with child custody. She and Wendy would exchange these very lengthy emails where Donna would call Dan derogatory names, telling Wendy to take control of her life. Donna did not want Dan to think he had won anything by Wendy losing the right to move back to Miami with the boys. Donna said they needed to hit Dan's weak points, which would be money, religion, and control. She reminds Wendy there are 5 weeks until a court date for them. Donna says that her life, her husband Harvey's life, which is also Wendy's father, and Charlie, which is Wendy's brother's life, will be affected based on how well Wendy can perform and act before July 31st. Her mom tells her, "You can be a good actress when you want to. You need to put on the performance of your life. Dan hasn't beaten the Adelson family yet. We helped you for the last 10 months. Now it's time to help yourself." Donna also suggested that Wendy threatened to convert the boys to Catholicism, which obviously would have been very devastating to Dan, as he was Jewish and he was raising the boys as he was raised. Donna wrote, quote, "Take control from him. He's going to want you to stop this," end quote. Other evidence showing Donna would do anything to hurt Dan included her suggesting they dress the boys up in Hitler costumes. The divorce ultimately was finalized on July 1st, 2013, and the judge gave split custody of the boys. Dan moved on. He began dating a woman, and it was going very well. Friends noticed Dan seemed really happy again and encouraged him to leave the negativity of this bitter custody battle with the Adelsons behind and just enjoy being happy again. Wendy also began dating again, who oddly bore a little bit of a resemblance to Dan Markel. Well, if you think things got nasty before, buckle up. It's just getting started. It was no secret to Dan that his former mother-in-law, Donna, hated him. Dan would FaceTime the boys. And on one session, one of his sons told him that Grandma Donna called him stupid, that he was trying to take away her sunshines away from her, and also that she hated Dan. On May 15th of 2014, Dan had a hearing in family court where he was asking that Donna only be allowed supervised visitation with his sons. That hearing was continued, and unfortunately, Dan was killed before another hearing could be rescheduled. There was also another hearing that wasn't heard before Dan's murder, where Dan was accusing Wendy of not accurately disclosing her financial records. Wendy's family went so far as to suggest that the family offered Dan $1 million to allow Wendy to relocate to Miami, with the mother, Donna, contributing a third, Wendy contributing a third, and also Charlie, Wendy's brother, contributing a third of that $1 million. Moving forward to the day of the murder, July 18th, 2014, just after 11 a.m. Dan had dropped the boys off at school between 9 and 9:30, and then he went to the gym. He returned home, pulled into the garage, and was on the phone with a School of Arts and Sciences teacher about Wendy, who was looking to enroll their sons into this school without his knowledge. The teacher said that he and Dan spoke for several minutes, and when he heard him say, "Hold on a second, there's someone in my driveway that's unfamiliar to me." The man told police he heard a loud grunt, which did not sound good, muffled voices, and then labored breathing. He asked Dan if he was okay, but got no response. A neighbor heard the gunshot and right after looked towards Dan's house and saw a Prius peel away from the scene. The neighbor called 911. He was recounting what he saw and heard, and he said he was currently in the garage with Dan. He said the driver's side window is bashed in. The car is still running, and Dan has blood all over his head and also was unresponsive. Dan had been shot twice in the head at close range. In a very eerie photo, we see tempered glass all around, broken glasses that were on the face of Dan Markel as he was shot. EMS arrives, but not until much later due to a mix-up of the address. But Dan is still alive. He was transported to Tallahassee Memorial Hospital. They notify Wendy. And at the time she was notified, she was having lunch with a friend. They asked her to come to the police station where they tell her there was a shooting at Dan's house. He was hit and he is in the hospital and he's not going to survive. Wendy says, "Oh my God." She begins crying, saying she doesn't understand and asks what happened. She's questioned for hours. She has her phone taken. She's fingerprinted. She's photographed. She's also swabbed for gunshot residue. The officer informs Wendy she's not under arrest, and Wendy says, "I understand why you think I'm the primary suspect." The investigator says, "No, you're not the primary suspect. I have to work just as hard whether you are or you're not. But over the course of the interview, Wendy is very open with the investigator about hers and Dan's struggles, saying that Dan caused her a lot of grief, but she would never do something like this. And she again says, "So I understand why I would be the person you would think would do something. I want to figure out who this is." She tells the investigator that Dan was emotionally abusive to her, but she largely kept that to herself. And people's assumptions on the surface about the demise of their marriage was it just didn't work out. She said her family did witness how Dan treated her. Wendy told the investigator Dan would tell people in the community that Wendy was mentally ill because only a crazy person would leave him. When asked if she knew anyone who might have a beef with Dan, she hesitates and then she says her ex-boyfriend at the time, Dan, hurt her. She said, "I see why he's a good suspect." She said she had recently asked Jeff for space in the relationship and goes on to speculate if asking him for space maybe made him snap. At one point during the interview, she calls her mother Donna from the interview room and says, "I need you to sit down." And she said, "Danny's been shot." And something that I thought was very odd, she said that she was relieved to hear that her parents were surprised by the news. She said she was trying to think of who might be angry enough to do something like this. And she admits her parents were very angry with Danny, but not capable of something like this. She said she could not handle something like that right now. She goes on to say that her parents have more reason to dislike Danny than almost anyone else because he hurt their daughter. But even her family, who felt she had been mistreated, would never do anything like this. Dan died early the next morning after his shooting, less than 24 hours later. And his parents, who still lived in Canada, were called and told of their son's death. His dad said he wished he could have been there to hold Dan's hand. Dan's funeral was held on July 24th in North York, Ontario. There were people there from all walks of life, including colleagues, friends, family. They just packed the church to say goodbye to Dan. And one person notably absent from that funeral was Dan's brother-in-law, Charlie Adelson. Overall, the murder shook Tallahassee. Fellow law professors were on edge, wondering if they were next. A colleague of Dan's said one day he was leaving his office and looked, and a Prius pulled right beside his car. And in that moment, he thought, "Am I next?" There were no suspects, and speculation as to who would have done this ranged from a disgruntled student of Dan's, a serial killer, a road rage incident, and just a random shooting. There were no suspects, and evidence was pretty much non existent. Investigators started to work the theory that the shooting seemed personal. Nothing was taken. It wasn't a robbery. Nobody went in the house. Nobody pulled anything out of his pockets. It was just an execution. 3 days before Dan's funeral, on July 21st of 2014, they brought in Wendy's ex, Jeff Lacasse, for questioning. And he says he was madly in love with Wendy. He said nobody has spent more time with Wendy over the course of 6 months than he had. He said that Wendy has this charisma, and he's not the only man who's been under her thumb in that way. He said Wendy has this sexuality to her, and that it makes you want to throw yourself in front of a bus for her. He said that was a new thing for him, and he was in love with her. The investigator asked if he had ever had any physical contact with Dan, and he said he had not. But he goes on to say that he's surprised they didn't call him sooner because he admits he has said many times publicly that he would like to beat Dan up because Dan was making Wendy suffer. But he said he would never do anything like that at the end of the day. Ultimately, Jeff's alibi was solid. It checked out. He was out of town, staying at a Days Inn about 20 miles south of Atlanta, so he was cleared as a suspect. But Jeff would go on to give investigators that very first big clue that would lead them in the right direction. And even though it would take years to get there, Jeff was worried about revealing what he thought could have happened. He cited concerns for his safety, but ultimately, Jeff laid bare the things that he saw and heard in the time he was dating Wendy. He wants to stress to the investigator that he's scared. Dan was just murdered. He doesn't want to be next. He apologizes for being paranoid, but he says he has ideas about who may want to kill Dan Markel. Dan goes on to tell the investigator about Wendy's family and their desperation to have Wendy and the boys back in Miami close to them. In another interview on March 6, 2015, he said the family hated Danny in a way that is obsessive. And he said he's never seen anything like that before. He said the Adelsons' hobby was hating Danny. The Greenbergs, also friends of Danny's, are interviewed by investigators and tell a very similar story. Alex Greenberg says the Adelsons are just mean, and to do some of the things they did to Danny during the course of the divorce was just not reasonable. In the meantime, investigators are beginning to look at surveillance footage from before the murder of Dan, his activities that morning, and then looking through city cameras, and they start to piece some things together. Dan is seen leaving the gym through the door, and then just moments later, his car is seen leaving the parking lot in his black car. Trailing him is this light-colored Prius. The Prius is also seen in a video from a city bus's dash cam and also a side camera. This was at 10:55 a.m., just minutes before Dan was executed in his garage. Also seen on another bus camera just moments after the shots were heard, there's the Prius moving in the opposite direction of Dan's house. The car was also caught on various cameras around Tallahassee. Ultimately, Wendy left Tallahassee and lived in Miami with her parents for about a year. Fast forward to May of 2015, Wendy finds a 2-bedroom apartment in Miami Beach for her and the boys. She was a law clerk for a federal judge. On the outside, seemed to be doing very well. This is when Wendy took the creative writing class that we referenced earlier about that podcast. She talked very openly about her feelings about Dan on that podcast. And in one episode, she says, 10 months ago, someone killed the father of my children. First, we got divorced, and then he got murdered. She goes on to joke about what she should call Dan, saying, I don't know whether to call him my ex-late spouse or my late ex-spouse, except that late ex-spouse sounds like latex spouse. She said it feels sacrilegious these days to even suggest something less than heroic about my latex husband because he was murdered. The case seemingly went cold for 2 years, but in the background, investigators are working this Prius lead. They're also doing other things we will get into in other episodes. Their focus was finding out just who was inside this Prius that was seen at various places where Dan was, and also in his driveway at the time of the murder. There were 2 occupants inside. None of the videos were able to get the license plate number or photos of the men until later. What's the one thing you can do? You release information to the public about the Prius, asking for help. There were some key details on the Prius that were of interest, and it separated it from the many Priuses in the area. They shared these distinctions publicly. The Prius color was a silver pine mica. So depending on the lighting, the Prius may look silver. In other lighting, it may look a shade of green. The passenger side mirror was black. The driver's side mirror was the same color as the car. That's how it should be. We know this black mirror on the passenger side at some point had been replaced. The car was missing a tow cap in the front. Also, it looked like there was a window pass for toll roads mounted on the center of the front window. Tallahassee doesn't have toll roads. This was beneficial to investigators because that led them to Mid and South Florida, where there are plenty of toll roads. They begin searching statewide for a Prius of the same color that has a toll pass. They finally get their break. The Prius had been rented from a mom and pop place in Miami that mostly only rented hybrid cars. They go question the owners, and the owners produce a rental agreement signed by Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia. That car was rented on July 15th. Once investigators begin to look deeper, they can't find any connection between Sigfredo and Dan. Now, Miami police were well aware of Luis Rivera. He was the first crown, or in other words, the leader of the North Miami Beach chapter of the Latin Kings gang. His street name was King Tato. On the other hand, Sigfredo was not gang affiliated, but he did have a lengthy criminal record. 22 prior arrests, the first arrest coming when he was 14 for vehicle theft. His street name was Tuto. Luis and Sigfredo had been friends since they were teenagers, and investigators got a search warrant for their phone records. And this is where they know they've got the right people. It showed the 7-hour trip Sigfredo and Luis took from South Florida all the way up from Tallahassee. That trip started on July 16th. On the day of the murder, Friday, July 18th, cell phone pings show Sigfredo and Luis going north on I-75 towards Tallahassee. Later that morning, cell phone data also shows Luis and Sigfredo just outside the gym where Dan was, which correlates with that surveillance camera footage of the Prius trailing Dan as he left. After the murder, the cell phone data shows their route back to Miami. They're seen on ATM surveillance. You can see their faces clearly, and they're driving that Prius. Sigfredo was arrested at a gas station in Hollandale Beach, which is just north of Miami, and that was on May 25th, 2016, for the murder of Dan Markel. He was also charged with possession of cocaine. On the other hand, Luis was already in custody on racketeering charges. We aren't even close to finished. On the next episode, we will dive deeper into the events before the murder. We will bring in wiretaps. We will bring in new information that we learned at these trials. We'll talk about Catherine Magbanowa and her connection to the hitman and also Charlie Adelson. So that's it for today, y'all. Wanted to go ahead and do a foundation episode of Who's Who. I will always have this graphic on the right side of the screen. I have arrows pointed with connections to people. And I think that helps in a case like this where there are so many different players to be able to look to the right if you're on YouTube to reference that to make sure you get everybody straight. But I guarantee you by the end of the series, you're going to know everybody's name and face and their role in this terrible murder. I never understand when you have these custody disputes, why do you think it's okay to kill the parent? You're not thinking about the burden you're laying on these children later in life when they learn what happened to their parent and learn that really the messed up reason this man was executed in his garage was so that these kids could be in Miami with the Adelsons. The boys are 13 and 14 now. A lot of time has passed, a lot of years under the influence of the Adelsons. It took a very long time for the first Adelson to be arrested in connection with this murder. Who knows what they've been raised to believe? On the next episode, we're going to really dive deep. This was just putting the framework up. Hope you have a good rest of your evening. We will see you soon.